All right, everyone, what's up? Today we're going to be talking a little bit about asset material. What would make someone a good potential asset? So, me, I've worked in private intelligence for a little bit. Nothing formal with the CIA or FBI or any other intelligence agencies, internationally recognized or never part of like a government intelligence agency. I wouldn't even consider the FBI much of like an intelligence agency. I mean, yes, they do investigation and stuff, and they will gather intel, but they don't really do anything along the lines of what I guess what you would call real spy agencies do. They do have rules to follow. They kind of go by all these little principles and everything, and rules and guidelines and regulations, and this chain of command. Whereas other intelligence agencies simply don't do this. They really don't. I mean, yes, they still have to answer to someone. Yes, they still have to follow guidelines, but it's ultimately the mission dictates the means. Obviously, there's OPSEC, there's, handling compromising information, all that good stuff. And there is the politics of it. So, as far as what can make someone a potential asset, or what kind of thing would really stand out to a recruiter. And the first thing is going to be trauma and abuse, right? Trauma, abuse, and control. Now, I'm using the term trauma, abuse, and control very loosely because in an abusive relationship, right, it's oftentimes going to be that the scapegoat, or I should say not the scapegoat, but the bystander is more important than the target, especially if this target is like a scapegoat target. You want to make this target a scapegoat, you want to isolate them, and you want to continue to attack them and to control them and to manipulate them. Great example I can think of was actually with Elliot Rodger. Now, I'm not saying that Elliot Rodger was an intelligence asset or an asset for anyone, but he would have fit the markers. He would have fit all of them. And if I was someone doing recruiting, I would have looked at him and been like, yeah, no, I would want him. I'd want him, simple as that, right? Because there's multiple things about it. First of all, there's the obvious ones, his fantasies about, hurting people, taking their lives, his manifesto, and then, of course, the fact that, he's a bit like very, very socially antisocial, very much of a vulnerable personality. I see it very much like a vulnerable borderline, sort of a personality that needs approval and validation, but at the same time is very vulnerable. Also, there was something that really stood out to me, and a lot of people miss this, unless if you have specifically been targeted or has been a scapegoat in particular in a controlling or narcissistic relationship. And if you have been, you probably know where I'm getting at. So, first things I noticed about him was, well, the luxury stuff. He had this new BMW, this, expensive high-end car, relatively. He wore name brand clothing. He had the Armani sunglasses. He had the business suit. He had all this high-end luxury stuff, but yet he's having all these other problems. One of the things that I noticed was his relatively boyish appearance. It was kind of, innocent looking, boyish, not really, much sex appeal. Now, I'm not saying that this is the result of the abuse and manipulation, although this kind of, when I put everything together, this would indicate to me that this person is a potential asset, right? Because logically speaking, if this guy wanted to get with the ladies, he wanted to be these bad boys or whatever. If he wanted to be like these guys, he could just trade in all this stuff, right? Sell the car, trade it in for some, Camry or whatever, as long as it works. Sell his luxury clothing, and then, I don't know, get plastic surgery, go do an exercise regime, spend money on a bulking regimen, perhaps get an apartment somewhere and sort of live out this, bad boy, fuck boy lifestyle, right? He could have done that, but he didn't. So all this indicates to me there's an underlying control mechanism. And what could I pitch him? Well, I could pitch him this kind of sense of freedom. Look, yes, and I'm going to come from a place of understanding. It's like, wow, you must be in this really, really shitty relationship. You're being abused. I mean, I can see it. And, I may even try to cater to his personality type. So what could I do? I could open up with some pretty, some kind of jokes that he could relate to and I could relate to. I could relate to it because I'm trying to pitch him, give him a pitch. I'm trying to give him a sales pitch here. And so, I could agree with him on certain things that society finds very taboo. Now, there's sort of these two little lines, if you will. The first one is it conflicts with consensus narrative. Something that conflicts with consensus narrative. And this joke or this ideology also has a lot of truth to it. It might not necessarily be easily verified, especially if, of whatever system is propping up the consensus narrative doesn't want to. It's going to be very difficult to study it and to publish it and to, in other words, make this truth official. But it's something that we all kind of know deep down inside is true. A lot of us just don't want to admit it because, it conflicts with the consensus narrative. What have you, right? So this idea, this guy's Elliot Rodger, he's an incel. He's, and as part of this incel movement, they're obsessed with their looks. They think it's all about, being good looking, being tall, handsome, having sex appeal, so on and so forth. So, we're walking back to the fact that logically speaking, based on his own logic, he could have just sold everything and, dedicated his life to, I don't know, looks maxing, right? Being this more sexually appealing version of himself, being this Chad and sleeping with a bunch of women. But he didn't, despite having all this really expensive stuff. That tells me, well, it's not really his stuff. And there's a lot of stipulations to what he has. So now you're going to give him this pitch of not necessarily freedom, but you're offering him a way out. You're offering him a solution to his problems. You're not offering them freedom. You're not going to say, hey, look, I'm going to give you $100,000 and you can just run off and do whatever the fuck you want. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to offer him the solution to his problems. Hey, look, if you sign on with me, I'll let you hang out at my place and you can, take all the steroids you want. You can go to the gym, you can study game, you can go to nightclubs. I'll even drive you around there. What else? I don't know. I'll give him cash and he can spend that cash on whatever the fuck he wants. Now, I'm not going to give him large sums of cash. I'll give him little amounts of cash. I could give him, what he needs to accomplish his goals. I'm going to be supportive of him. Now I have a recruit, and that recruit views me as sort of this hero figure, as sort of a second father figure. Now, I'm not saying that he was an asset or that he was intentionally manipulated into this. I'm just saying that he meets a lot of the markers of what a potential asset could be and what would really jump out to a recruiter. Or if someone is in the process of recruiting, what that looks like. And, they're all there. You have the seeming wealth, right? This sort of illusion of wealth. And he does have a lot of expensive stuff. But he doesn't really have much freedom. There's all these stipulations attached, and there's an underlying control mechanism. Why? Because he's got all this expensive stuff, but yet he has all these other problems going on. It doesn't add up. I mean, that to me right there, I could see that and say, oh, wow, there's this underlying control mechanism. There's this sort of, I can essentially pull apart this personality and figure it out. Thanks, guys. That's about it. Take care.